Hey guys, how's it going? Jason Station here, welcome back to the channel. So for today's video, I wanted to do another sort of recap of what's kind of been going on. It's been a week after the newest expansion, as well as a few days right after Worlds. We did receive a hotfix today as well, so there's a lot to talk about. Between sort of the top decks of the meta, what decks I expect to kind of get tossed around, and I want to show you guys 7 decks that I think will fit in nicely for this week and moving forward into the newest hotfix of the patch. So let's jump into it, and welcome to this sort of like, I don't know, meta report slash deck thingy mabobber. I need to figure this out, man. Whatever. We had a video like this previously, so it's kind of an extension of it, but let's dive into it. So for the past week, so this is going to be the current expansion. I don't think anyone should be surprised at Aatrox's popularity. This is something that absolutely showed up at Worlds, and of course is one of, if not, or one of the stronger, maybe even the strongest sort of mid-range style of deck, because Aatrox is really just that ultimate stat stick that really cages people and traps people into seeing if they can get through it, and most of the time they can't, right? Now, one thing that actually came out sort of right after Worlds, and not necessarily an result of Worlds, but more as just as people were experimenting with it, was this Ziggs Reliquary deck. And I think something very interesting to keep in mind here is that this 24,000 matches, even though it's the second most popular deck, this had maybe 3 days or so, whereas this had the whole week. So this deck really popped out of nowhere seemingly, and kind of has had taken over Ladder by storm. Now within the hotfixes, this deck has been touched, so I don't really expect to see this around anymore. Of course, we have card decks like Champion Strength, the Elite, or the Gwen Katarina, definitely a very, very popular deck still. And again, a lot of these decks that are popular, are strong, and have been represented very well in Worlds. And I think, to no one's surprise, we still have this Gwen Katarina list that really continues to be a sort of a very evergreen kind of deck throughout every season. Outside of that, you have the Aatrox Quinn Vayne, which similar lines, right? It's just a Vayne Aatrox with the Quinn, and this was like a Worlds deck too. I think this one only has one Quinn, and it has like a champion string, but overall very similar builds that utilize very similar techs and tools to do very similar things. Double Cultist, and then we have a little bit of drop off here. Aggro has always been pretty popular. Annie Jhin, as well as something like the Jinx Demacia, this champion strength, are historically quite good counters into the Aatrox decks because they win before turn 6. So if you are facing a lot of Aatrox, again, those are probably some ways to deal with it, and some probably will to be ways of dealing with it. The rest, I don't really think there's too much to cover down here. It just really conglomerates into just a big blob of piles. But I think it's pretty clear to see how mid-range heavy this meta is, especially with the Aatrox, the Cultist, as well as Vayne kind of sticking to the top of it. And we have some other ways that people have tried to find ways of countering it. We have the Jinx, we have the Annie Jhin, and we have the Elise Gwen Katarina. So let's talk about the hotfixes really quickly, because this is going to be quite relevant to our discussion going forward into the meta. So the first things first is Acolyte's Reliquary. This is the landmark that generates the Acolyte, is going from a 1 cost to a 2 cost. Unforgiving Cold is the Cultist Freeze, the Harsh Winds, going from 4 cost to 5. Champion Strength going from 8 cost to 9, and then Blooming Cultist no longer gets the Attune. And let's talk about sort of the relevance of every nerf. So Acolyte's Reliquary is going to be the biggest nerf. When you have a cost increase, the lower cost the card is, the more impactful it is, because this is a 100% cost increase, whereas this is only a 25, and this is only like a 16%, right? So this card has absolutely tanked the deck, and I think just first day data shows some very, very poor performance from the Acolyte deck. And I think it's almost safe to say that I think this deck is going to disappear, at least for a bit, until people realize it still beats some strategies, but probably not enough that aren't just like really hard control decks. And I think that Acolyte's Reliquary is mostly going to disappear from the meta overall. So that's going to leave a hole there, and we can talk about that a bit later as well. Unforgiving Cold. So this is a card that has pretty much been like almost always slotted into the Cultist decks between 1 to 2 to 3 copies, usually leaning more on the upper side. Now, this change probably isn't as impactful. The card itself is still fantastic in a mid-range dominated meta where you know you're fighting over board. This is still going to be a very fantastic deck card, and it's still going to hit exact same moments. You just need one extra mana. This might screw some things over, might ruin some other curves here and there, but overall it's still going to be a strong enough card that justifies being able to run in the deck, especially because even in the cultist region itself, you already have good cards that you do want to run, such as Momentous Choice, Furious Wielder, and Unforgiving Cold. Still a very fantastic card given the meta, so I don't really see this being cut from the deck, but it does matter. Mana breakpoints do matter overall, and it's going to see a little bit of nerf. I don't really see this affecting the popularity of cultist decks. Maybe people shift away from it for a little bit just because they don't want to play with nerf cards. But in the current meta, I think this change is still not going to have as much of an impact towards any of these cultist decks in particular. Now, champion strength is an interesting one. Some decks care about this, especially like the Jinx Demacia ones, the ones that want to click the button on turn 5. Care about this a lot because sometimes you can't play it on turn 5. You still have the ability to run Acorn in your deck, so there is still potential to place on turn 5. Now maybe you can't play it on turn 4 sometimes because then you need a double discount, and if you're attacking on evens, that's simply not possible. So it does cut away the ability to play champion strength on a turn 4 attack. You just can no longer do that, and that does eat away a little bit at the power level. But regarding this card's polarization in the meta, the difference between a turn 4 and a turn 6, for the most part, if we're talking about against like Aatrox, things like that, doesn't necessarily matter all that much. And it's really just still the turn 5, turn 6, right? Now, if you're attacking on odds and now that turn 5 becomes a turn 7, that could matter a decent amount, but at least you still have 2 attacks to like potentially find Acorn and champion strength. So at the very least, the decks that get impacted the most by this are the faster ones, right? The Jinx deck, maybe some Vandal City ones, whatever, right? Some other slower mid-range Demacia decks who still play champion strength see this less impactful, where they're not slamming it on turn 5, turn 6. They still need to develop board. Maybe they're just playing as like a one of, and they can play it on turn 7, turn 8, turn 9, where they can still utilize it to close out games. And when we get to that mana cost, it's sort of like harrowing, right? Where the difference between 9 and 10 is just a little bit less, because in the later turns, you don't really have many things to pair with your big kind of play, right? When it's harrowing, when it's champion strength, all sort of falls in the same boat. Maybe you can't squeeze out that Pale Cascade or that single combat or whatever that card might be. But overall, the decks that it does affect are the faster ones as compared to the slightly more mid-rangey ones, right? So that's, I expect maybe like the Jinx deck to fall down a little bit, but given the fact that I think Aatrox is still going to reign supreme, I still think between like turn 5, turn 6, turn 7, you're still pretty okay attacking with this. Now, Blooming Cultist no longer gets the attune. It's hard to say. Attune is always great. This is essentially almost the same thing as an increase in mana, just given the fact that, well, the cultist decks could utilize mana very efficiently because they want to equip weapons that cost spell mana, playing spells cost spell mana. Like, they want to do both of that. Losing Attune, essentially, you can think about this as almost the same thing as it going from a 3 cost to a 4 cost, although not exactly. Maybe it's like a 3 to 3.7, you know, kind of like Delios. But overall, there's still a big increase in cost, and probably the second most impactful one compared to Acolyte's Reliquary, because Blooming Cultist, I don't think, is a card that you can realistically cut from your deck, because there are positions where you can just high roll a scout weapon and put on your Blooming Cultist and rally with it Vayne or something like that, right? So there, and just the fact that you have Elusive does kind of apply a lot of pressure. This card is potentially cuttable. Maybe you replace it with like Combat Cook or select card from your region, but it's tough to no longer have the attune here. You might start to see other options for this 3-drop slot, but it really isn't something that I see impacting the power level of the cultist cards very much, or the cultist decks. At most, at the very least, they might still play the card. At most, they will replace it for something that they find a little bit better in that 3-drop slot. So looking at the hotfixes, realistically, the only change, I guess the two most impactful changes, the Ziggs Reliquary deck is probably going to disappear from the meta, and the Jinx deck, at least that being the most popular champion strength deck, is going to have a little bit of a slower time assembling their victory. And, but for the most part, that really isn't going to be the most impactful, especially with cards like Acorn, as well as Aatrox being very prevalent in the meta. So the turn 6, turn 7 kill is still something that is still going to threaten Aatrox decks overall. So I'll give some quick predictions as to where I kind of see the meta shifting, or at least we can just dial into the last 2 days and kind of compare, and then we can kind of give an overall trend from there. Ziggs Reliquary, you can just cross off the list. This is probably going to disappear. And this Ziggs Talia, this is also Reliquary deck. This might be slightly slower. No, this is basically just a reliquary deck as well. So this is going to disappear. I think Ziggs Talia has some room just in the mid-range meta, especially because we saw it in Worlds winning against Aatrox decks and things like that. So Talia Ziggs, you know, is potential to be on the map, but this kind of reliquary thing, I think is something of the past. Aatrox, Kayn, Jinx, Demacia being the two most popular decks. And look at this margin, actually. That's insane. Like, look at this margin between the top 2 decks and like the rest of the decks. That's almost 5 to 4 times as many games played on Aatrox Kayn compared to Jinx Demacia. Because when we're looking at this, this is like one of the best matchups for this deck, right? So just by numbers and by popularity, it's very surprising to me. And I do expect this kind of, you know, deck to still be very, very popular. If not this deck, the Aatrox Vayne deck that we see down here, which is almost like an eighth of the play rate, which is kind of crazy. Outside of that, I think some good contenders. I guess Jinx Teemo kind of fits into the bill as well. So this gets an additional maybe 1,000 games. So that's like roughly like 4,000. So maybe like a third compared to Aatrox Kayn. But some other decks that we have seen kind of pop up, discard aggro actually kind of on the map. A lot more aggro decks coming out of the woodworks in response to the Aatrox Kayn. Now, I think the reason why a lot of aggro decks, especially like Jinx Demacia, you know, things like things like the Annie Jin, things like the discard aggro are coming on the woodworks in response, not only in response to the Aatrox Kayn, but also the fact that SI control and SI failure just doesn't really exist, right? You don't really see SI control or SI failure anywhere until the 39th most played deck. And although I think for a very big part of that, it's because of the reliquary deck. There's no SI failure deck in the world that can beat Ziggs reliquary. But now that the reliquary deck is going to disappear, I do expect the SI failure to kind of ramp up in response to the Jinx deck, in response to the discard aggro. And so I think you'll be seeing a little bit more SI control decks overall, whether it be like the Victor Seraphine, whether it be Trundle Tryndamere Field Rush, things like that. And we'll have a little bit of a newer triangle. So we have the Aatrox Vayne that gets dunked on by the aggro decks. We have the control decks that dunk on the aggro decks. And I am assuming that Aatrox Kayn or Aatrox Vayne still just dunk on the control decks as well. So that's kind of like the newer triangle that we're probably going to be getting outside of the Ziggs deck. Some other sort of on the side decks that function pretty okay into the sort of like mid-range, maybe struggle a little bit more into Aatrox in particular, but still do okay into aggro, is like the Seraphine decks, especially with the removal of the reliquary decks, which have been a big thorn, I would say, to this overall Seraphine side, because Seraphine still also has Caustic Rift as an answer to these kind of go wide decks. I should be expecting some more Seraphine decks in the horizon. Gwen Katarina, always a staple. And then, you know, things like Azir Xerath is questionable. I'm unsure about why it's very popular, why its play rate is so high in relativeness. I suspect this to be more of like a Worlds thing. When people saw Mono stream at Worlds, I think people got a little bit excited. Annie Jin's still just decent into Pantheon, not Pantheon, but Aatrox. And I think just a pile of other mid-range decks just because of the popularity of the mid-range meta. I think one of those is this Alakshon Sivir Varus deck. This was played in Worlds and has shown to be decently promising in pressuring your Aatrox player into giving them bad board positions. So also I think a decent contender for the mid-range meta. But otherwise, you know, outside of these, we have a bunch of stuff down here that I probably won't go into. But that's just sort of how I'm expecting the meta to shape out. And let's dive into 7 of sort of coolish newer decks of the new expansion, and maybe some decks that I think are kind of on the rise and should prove to be pretty decent all-arounders. The first one, of course, is the Kayn Aatrox, and of course, on a side note, the Vayne Aatrox, which is also just very similar in game plans. This one is focused on 3 Aatrox, 3 Kayn, and is just really just the king of sort of mid-range right now, right? Especially with Aatrox just absolutely shutting things down with the World Ender. Once you level up Aatrox, you start to just dump Darkens out, or you have some Darkens to assimilate, and you have this way to swing and end the game. Having both decent interaction and decent protection in forms of Furious Field or Momentous Choice, as well as Unforgiving Cold. Even though this is going to 5 mana, I still think you have a very wide range of tools. Now, the popular list of this deck might change given the Blooming Cultist nerf. Maybe you slot in a better 3-drop, albeit it has to be exactly a Cultist 3-drop, which I don't think exists. So you might see a little bit more of the Kayn or the Vayne Aatrox instead over the traditional Kayn Aatrox. But overall, still just very, very similar decks in terms of what they do, as well as what kind of cards they share. Now, the Demacia Aatrox does get to utilize the Heart plus the Challengers, and that can be a lot better in sort of these mid-range matchups, and might be the more favorite to kind of come out of it, because you see the Heart plus the Broadwing or the Fleet Feather Tracker, or even like the Valor, which some decks run, is actually quite good. So let's also just drag this alongside. I guess we can make this 8 decks, why not? This is real-time feedback. And then just very similar, this one gets to utilize the Challengers plus the Quick Tech, which is a lot better in these terms of mid-range matchups, and doesn't have any of the nerf cards, the Cultist card or the Unforgiving Cold. So if you're worried about the nerf cards, you'll see that this deck might just be one of the top contenders. Being an Aatrox deck and not getting nerfed is probably really, really good. Of course, getting still to utilize the Vayne Tumble plus the Scouts, Roar of Acacia to equip weapons and discount Aatrox, I think has some cool utilizations outside of specifically what the Kayn version can do as well. Next up, we have Leona Kayle. This is an interesting sort of mid-range deck. Again, you know, this common theme with the mid-range stuff, but this is a slower version of a champion strength deck utilizing the Leona Daybreak package, which we have seen come into recent popularity with the Diana Leona sort of SI Winding Light deck, now instead capping off with champion strength and utilizing the Daybreak buffs to enable Kayle as sort of a quick attack or overwhelm unit. Also has some good options as well. The benefit to Leona Daybreak, of course, having the stuns to really slow down mid-range decks, as well as the ability to actually scale units with like Sun Guard and even Raven coming out as a 5/6, just gives you fantastic targets for things like single combat as well as Concerted Strike. And the ability to play Sunburst, which can be fantastic tempo into Aatrox. Being able to kill Aatrox for 5 spell mana is a very fantastic swing, because you can still develop board, or maybe it's a Daybreak, so it's stunning on your attack turn, and it's a very fantastic way to apply pressure. So definitely one of the more interesting mid-range decks out there, utilizing Kayle, and as well as response to other mid-range decks as well in the meta. Next up, we have a little bit of a surprise. I did want to try to feature as many of the newer decks as I could. We showcased Aatrox, we showcased Kayle, and now, of course, I want to showcase Ryze. And before we kind of brush this off, this particular Ryze deck, somebody was playing to about a 60-ish, mid 60% win rate over 70 games. And I believe this is the only positive Ryze, or at least like full-on Ryze deck. The only Ryze deck with a positive win rate. And this is utilizing Ionia with Master Yi, which is an interesting choice. But Master Yi does give you a discount, and because you have the ability to play Ryze spells like Trinket Trade and things like that, you actually have a decent way of activating flow. And I think something really interesting is Claws of the Dragon being played in this deck, where you can kind of just burst out blockers and kind of catch opponents off guard. Especially with nerfs of Reliquary, I think slower decks like Ryze can see a little bit of an emergence back into the meta. and because of the fact that I think Ryze so far has been underdeveloped in terms of what deck builds look like, and sort of under mastered in terms of how much time and effort players are spent into figuring out how to play Ryze. I can see this coming in pretty well, especially when Unworthy Soul is just a very good card as well into a lot of these weapon-based mid-range decks, right? So I think that this deck actually has a pretty decent chance into the heavy mid-range meta. We've seen Ionia decks with like the Homecoming, with like the Stall, with like the Balance performing quite well into mid-range metas, especially like the Ari Cannon and things like the Scion. So it'd be very interesting to see how this performs into the coming week. But if you guys are looking for a Ryze deck, this is probably the one I would recommend. Moving on, I think one of the coolest mid-range deck I have seen come out of this week is this Vayne Illaoi deck, utilizing the newest equipment, Eye of God, which is an two-man equipment that says attack spawn 2. And this works in a very different sort of mid-range style, right? It's not the same sort of Aatrox game plan where you're kind of going wide on board and pressuring through your equipments. Maybe you end with World Ender, right? This is kind of more of a go tall situation where you're just making a really big tentacle, because again, lack of SI, lack of vengeance, lack of quietus, not a lot of ways to deal with Illaoi, not a lot of ways of dealing with a big tentacle. Because if you have a big tentacle, and the way mid-range matchups work is that if you have the bigger unit, well, your opponent is going to have a very difficult time attacking into you. It's going to give you the advantage with strike spells and things like that. And so the goal of this particular deck is just to make a big tentacle, buff up Illaoi, and kind of swing in, give the tentacle overwhelm, use Vayne to tumble in an overwhelm tentacle, use Cataclysm, and still have the ability to just play Champion Strength as a Demacia sort of mid-range deck. So I think this has some very, very cool utilizations in sort of facing some other mid-range decks, and also playing in a slightly different playstyle compared to some of the more weapon-based Aatrox Vayne decks, Aatrox Varus, whatever it may be, right? So I think this is actually a really, really cool deck, and I'm excited to see how this performs. Already showing pretty promising numbers, just not a lot of play rate, and I expect this deck to see a little bit more popularity. Next up, discard Aggro, filling in the slot of the Aggro deck alongside the Jinx Demacia deck. Now the Jinx Demacia deck with the Champion Strength is getting slightly nerfed. This instead is not, and is continuing to show decent promise, especially with the ability to kind of just squeeze out games against some of these slower mid-range decks, which historically kind of crumble into this sort of Flame Chompers game plan, right? So the ability to go wide, you have Legion Grenadier, you have the Vision, you have the Flame Chompers of the Boom Boom, the Jury Rigs, the Poro Cannon. Just a very, very fast ability to go very wide and kind of just race down your opponent in ways that mid-range decks can't really deal with. If you've ever played Champion Strength into like an Aatrox deck and you just have a 4-wide board, they really can't stop you from casting Champion Strength. In a very similar vein, if you can go wide very early, which this deck does a lot better, because the Champion Strength deck just kind of holds back their units, right? If you force out trades, they're not really going to have as much refill, and they have to spend more mana on board, and that slows down their tempo, right? So this is an aggro deck that doesn't rely on having that. It just push, and then having burn, right? So you might find this as a slightly more reliable option against Aatrox decks, and can probably even beat other Champion Strength decks because you're not afraid to trade down board. And so I see this as a very good contender if you are someone who does enjoy playing some aggressive decks. Two more decks, we have Trundle Vi. In terms of mid-range, this might be what you can possibly consider an anti-mid-range deck. And the reason for that is simply Buried in Ice plus It That Stares being a very fantastic combo into most mid-range decks, because again, mid-range decks usually develop into their attack turns, especially into this very weapon-heavy meta, and Obliterate just completely destroys the weapon, and then you destroy the unit as well, right? So in a lot of cases, when you kill the unit with the weapon goes back to the hand, they re-equip it, or they play it out as a Darken. You can kind of just go around that by playing Buried in Ice, which is a very fantastic card. And overall, the ability to like play Revna, the ability to kind of cheat out stats with concurrent timelines, very fantastic ability to kind of just make bigger units than your opponent is really the name of the mid-range game. And when you have cards like Trundle and Vi, his being some of the biggest champions for their cost, having Iceveil Archer, having Freezes, having Value Generation, having Aloof Travelers, having Revna for more stats, and just the Burn Ice It That Stares is always going to be a very, very good shout whenever there is a lot of mid-range in the meta. Last but not least, we have Ezreal Seraphine. This is a deck that I think is always going to be in somewhere as long as we have bar at 6 mana in its current state. This is a list that was actually played by Teddy in Worlds, so this did manage to get a second place slot. So that should give you a little bit of context behind, well, its relative power level as far as how good Seraphine still is in the meta, especially with nerfs to Reliquary overall. It's a little bit less polarizing in the sense that it's not going to crush aggro all the time, and it's not going to beat Aatrox all the time. It's going to fall somewhere in the middle, where it kind of just plays out as like a very even deck, the way that Aphelios decks might have played out long in the past, right? I'm not gonna read through all these 1-of cards for you guys, but overall, you know, it's still a Seraphine deck at the end of the day, just playing for outgrind, playing for tempo, and ending the game with a combination of Ezreal or Big Victor, or just overall outgrind your opponent. And I suspect something similar to this, or like even like a Seraphine Ryze Ezreal. And there's a lot of different Seraphine options out there still in the meta because of the existence of back alley bar, and will continue as long as some of the decks that were kind of strong into it are kind of tipped out. That's sort of a recap following the meta and 7 decks that I want hopefully for you guys to check out as you come into this next week of climbing. But thank you guys so much for tuning into the channel. Hope you guys enjoyed the video, and I'll see you guys next time. Peace, guys. Have a good one.